Welcome to the Weekly Review, a program brought to you by the South Sudan Network. I'm Samuel Garang, and I'm your host for today's show. This is part 2 of our episode for the week covering June 8th and June 14th, and with a particular focus on the status of the implementation of the peace agreement in South Sudan, or the so-called revitalized peace agreement in the Republic of South Sudan. Joining us is our producer and chief correspondent, Roger Yoron Modi. Roger, please welcome to the show.
Thank you, Garang.
Now, diving straight into the interview and the show, what is the latest with regards to the implementation of the revitalized peace agreement in South Sudan?
Well, within last week, there was a declaration about the part of some parts, like a part of the security arrangements of the revitalized peace agreement. So you have, that was on Tuesday, the 9th, the chairman of the ceasefire monitors, Major General Tesome Gemachu Adere, announced that most cantonment sites are near collapse because of lack of logistical support. General Adere, who is an IGAT appointee to the ceasefire monitoring body by the provisions of the revitalized agreement, made the remark at the technical committee meeting of the ceasefire monitors, adding that there is also a critical lack of logistic support to the training centers and other concerns, such as the lack of training syllabi at the centers and lack of clear directives on dates of graduation and funding. The purpose of the cantonment forces, the cantonment of forces, according to the agreement, was to enable registration of personnel, weapons, and equipment accountability, screening, reorganization and/or disarmament, and demobilization. Article 2, sub-article 2.2 of the agreement provides that forces in cantonment shall receive non-military logistical supplies, including food, shelter, and access to medical care. However, now those logistical support are lacking, as pointed out by the chairman of the ceasefire monitors and others also. That is the situation. The delays in the implementation of the agreement continue, and many times lack of funding is cited as the reason. It is still unclear if the forces shall be graduated and unified anytime soon, despite the several given and despite the several postponements that have already happened since the revitalized agreement was signed in September 2018. So
yeah, so like considering, this is not the, South Sudan has been at war since 2013. It's now, this is about the 7th year, and we have seen different peace agreement being, signed, promises being made, and there has persistently been this issue of, agreement being made and sometimes not those agreements being implemented, with the spirit and the letter. And so that includes like the funding, when you say you need cantonment, we need soldiers to be on the ground, to be trained within this number of months. It also has to correspond with equivalent level of funding for those activities to happen, because those activities cannot just be on paper and they are written. And so based on what you are saying right now, is the challenge is there's no funding for these activities, and like in the cantonment areas there are a lot of challenges which are going on. And so let's leave that at that for now. Now let's last week, the Chief of Defense Forces, General Juma Johnson Okot, he released a statement saying, and I'm quoting, President Salva Kiir, issuing a decree for the reassignment and the redeployment, sorry for my thick tongue here, but for the reassignment and redeployment of the military officers. And that decree was supposed to be effective from June 12th. And so now I assume that decree is already effective, and so with that deployment of the people and the decree that the president appointed Lieutenant General James Kong Tuol as Assistant Chief of Defense Forces for training. But as we all know, right, Lieutenant General James Kong Tuol was previously the Chief of Staff, or the Deputy Chief of Staff for Finance and Administration for the SPLM-IO, who is like one of the partners to the peace agreement. Now he has defected from the SPLM-IO to another side, to the government. And so what implication does that have with people moving back and forth between these different partners to the agreement? What implication does that have for the sustainability of the peace in South Sudan?
Well, the defections are violations of several provisions of the agreement, and that is the permanent ceasefire, for example, and transitional security arrangements, including Article 2.1.10.4, which, among others, prohibits the armed parties from recruitment and mobilization, and several others. So the defections of armed forces and their generals to any side amounts to recruitment and thereby a violation of the agreement. Even the immediate former interim chairperson of the peace monitors, that is the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission chairman, in his report to IGAD before leaving office, he wrote that, and I quote, "There have been instances of rank and file soldiers defecting and changing allegiance from one party to another. Ceasefire transitional security arrangement monitoring verification mechanism reports that this is expressly prohibited by cessation of hostilities agreement, Article 3.2 GE and Article 2.1.10.4 of the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan. Changing allegiance could also be seen as an activity that may jeopardize the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan, which is described as a prohibited act in Article 2.1.10.4 of the revitalized agreement." Unquote. So if the parties to the revitalized agreement are serious about its implementation, they should neither recruit new soldiers nor reward through a position in the army anyone who has defected from any of the parties. The same should apply to the South Sudan Opposition Movement Alliance, the non-signatories of the revitalized agreement, because they committed and recommitted themselves to the 2017 cessation of hostilities agreement through the Rome Declaration, which was signed in January this year in Rome, Italy, between the government of South Sudan and them, the South Sudan Opposition Movement Alliance.
So in this sense, Roger, it looks like this is a very complex situation where there's so much going on. There are so many moving parts, some things are happening here and there. And so let me ask you the final question about what is really being done to address this issue of the violation of the agreement, and specifically with reference to the security arrangement. What is being done as we
Well, the revitalized agreement provides that the ceasefire monitors, officially known as the Ceasefire Transitional Security Arrangements Monitoring Verification Mechanism, be responsible for reporting on the progress of the implementation of the permanent ceasefire and transitional security arrangements. And the ceasefire monitors, the ceasefire monitoring body, are comprising, according to the agreement, members from the parties, and that is the parties to the agreement, and civil society organizations, women bloc, youth, IGAD members that are appointed, like IGAD appointees, like for example, the chairperson of the ceasefire monitors is an IGAD appointee, and then you have AU, China, Troika, and so on, and including the United Nations mission in South Sudan and others. So it is responsible, that is the ceasefire monitoring body I'm talking about, is responsible for verification, compliance, and reporting directly to IGAD, Council of Ministers, and the peace monitors, that is the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, known as RJMEC. So that is their responsibility of monitoring and doing the other stuff that I've mentioned. While throughout the years, I don't think I ever saw the ceasefire monitors recommend punitive action against a party that violated the ceasefire or cessation of hostilities agreement. Last week, however, the chairperson of the ceasefire monitors, Major General Tesome Gemachu Dere, made very strong statements about these issues. And in his last week's address, the opening of the technical committee meeting of the ceasefire monitors, he said, he mentioned reports of a number of clashes between the various parties and groups in the recent past, including allegations of rape by SPLM-AIO in Maywood between the 1st and 4th of August 2019, and a report concerning incidents of violence and harassment against civilians which took place in the former River State and Central Equatoria State between November 2019 and March 2020. He then asked the meeting to, and let me quote this, he asked the meeting to, quote, focus on key issues arising from the reports and what must be done in terms of remedial action and accountability. We all need to obligatorily come up with an appropriate recommendation on how to timely stop the violations, unquote. Though the outcome of the meeting have not been published, it is something to follow, especially with regards to any attempt to stop violations of the permanent ceasefire and transitional security arrangements. for the parties to the Revitalize Agreement, and also the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement for the non-signatories of the Revitalize Agreement. So,
wow, that's immense. We'll follow up from there. Now, with that, we have come to the end of part 2 of the weekly review, making sense of the news, and with a special focus on the revitalized peace agreement in South Sudan. Thanks to you, our chief correspondent and producer, Roger Yoron Modi. And also thanks to you, our audience, for watching. Thank you so much. Continue to follow us on YouTube, on Facebook, as well as Twitter, and particularly our website, sawasawanetwork.org.